Hi, and thanks for stopping by our channel, Come Draw With Us. In this video, we are going to work on drawing this Papa Smurf. The first thing we need to do is change the blend mode of the outline. So click on the layer and then go ahead and change it to multiply. And then we're going to go ahead and reduce its opacity. Then at this point, we're basically going to create a new layer for each body part. So select that medium red and add a new layer and put it underneath the outline. And then go ahead and trace the foot and leg and then fill it in. And don't worry about matching the shape exactly where the hand and body is, because those layers will be covering this part. Because we're going to end up using so many layers, I'm going to go ahead and rename it just to help keep myself organized. You don't have to do that if you don't want, but I've found it to be helpful. And go ahead and select a new layer. And we're going to work on filling in part of his white hair. So I want to change the background color to just a more of a gray so that we can see the white hair and it stands out. So selecting the color white, go ahead and just fill in this little white sideburn. And again, don't worry about matching the shapes exactly because the other body parts will be covering it. The next layer we're going to do is going to be for his face, arm, and body. So just go ahead and select that medium blue and then trace your outline and fill in those body parts, and go ahead and rename that layer if you want to. We're going to do the eyes on the next layer, but just keep in mind we want to keep each eye on an individual layer. So do one layer with the left eye and one layer with the right eye, and go ahead and fill those colors in. The next layer is for the hat, the body, and the leg. So go ahead and select that middle red and trace them and fill them in. Then go ahead and create a layer for his ear and another layer for his arm. Our next layer will be for the sideburn, the other sideburn, and his beard. So just use white to trace them and fill them in. This next layer will be for the mouth. So go ahead and select that dark red and trace around and fill it in. Now we're going to fill in his skinny blue lips, so just create a new layer and use blue to trace it. Next, we're going to fill in the mustache, but in order to see it, we're going to have to reduce the opacity of the beard just because it's white on white. So on that layer, once you've reduced the opacity, just trace the mustache, and then you can go back and put the opacity to the beard back up to 100%. Alright, the last piece we have left to do is for the nose. So just create a new layer and trace and fill in the nose. Before we get started on the next step, I just want to briefly explain what we're going to be doing. With each of the layers we just created, we're going to be adding a couple of layers on top of each one and making them clipping masks, and we'll be using them for the shading and the highlights. The first layer we're going to start with is for the left leg, so add 2 new layers above it, make the one closest to it the blend mode of color burn, and also make them both clipping masks. When you use the color burn blend mode, you always want to use the color gray, and the lighter gray you use, it will make that color darker, but just not as dark. And if you choose a darker gray, then it makes the base color even darker. So you can just play around with shadows without altering the color. It will just darken the true color that's underneath. So on this color burn layer, select your soft brush, and then just go ahead and add shadows to the same parts that you see me do in the video. Now that we've added some shading, we want to go ahead and soften up the edges. So you're going to click on Adjustments and then click on Gaussian Blur and go ahead and blur it to 3%. So now we'll add the highlights. Go to the layer above the color burn layer, choose the lighter red, and using the soft brush, go ahead and just add highlights to the same areas that you see in the video. And then we'll do the same thing with the highlights as well. We'll go ahead and use the Gaussian blur to soften up the edges. Use the Gaussian blur tool again and blur it to about 5% for the highlights. And before we add any shading and highlights to the next layer, we want to go ahead and group these together just to keep them more organized. So just select the leg layer plus the 2 clipping masks and just create a group for it. And then because the next layer we're going to work on is for the sideburn, because it's a white color, we're only going to do 1 layer and just add some shadows. So you can keep it on a normal blend mode and go ahead and just use your soft brush and add shadows in the same place you see me, and then use the Gaussian blur effect to about 3%. Moving on to the face, arm, and body, create the 2 new layers using one with the color burn blend mode, make them both clipping masks, and go ahead and add shading to the same parts that you see me do in the video. Then just soften up those edges by using the Gaussian blur, again to about 3%. We also want to add some highlights to the hand. So go ahead to the second clipping mask layer and use just the light blue color, again with the soft brush, and just add highlights in the same areas. And then when you're done, go ahead and use the Gaussian blur tool. If you ever feel like your shadows or your highlights are too bright, you can go ahead and try and reduce the opacity. And here, I just thought the shadowing was a little bit too stark, so I tried to reduce the opacity and it didn't still fix the problem. So I'm using the smudge tool to go ahead and just kind of blend in those shades just a little bit better. So now we get to work on the iris and the pupil. So above the layer with the left eye, create a new layer, and using the monoline brush and the black color, just go ahead and create a perfect circle and fill it in. Now you want to duplicate that layer, and on the bottom one, alpha lock it, and then fill it in with the dark blue. Then go ahead to the black layer above it and reduce its size and center it in the middle of the blue circle so you've got your pupil. Once you've done that, go back to the blue circle layer, and using the light blue and using your soft brush, go ahead and add highlights underneath the pupil so that it just starts to show out around the outsides. You can also use the brush to just softly touch up the left side of the iris just to give it more of a highlight. And then for just a little bit more effect, I turned to the white and I added some more highlights still underneath the pupil, just to make it stand out a little bit more. And then I went back to the light blue and just draw a few lines in the iris, just to add some realistic effect to it. And then we'll go ahead and use the Gaussian blur tool to soften it up. And in this case, I only blurred it to about 2%. And now we want to add the white highlight to the eye. So go to your pupil layer, add a new layer, and using white and your soft brush, just go ahead and add a dot for the highlight. Then you can merge all of those layers together and duplicate it. And then just go ahead and center the pupil and iris on both eyes. Moving on to the red parts for the hat, the body, and the leg, go ahead and just add those two layers. Make one the color burn blend mode and make them clippy masks, and then go ahead and add shadows and highlights in the same places you see me do in the video. But as I was about to start working on his hat, I realized that we didn't add the highlights near the tops of the eyes on the face. So before we work on the shadowing on the hat, let's go back to the face layer, and using the light blue color again, just go ahead and add the highlight above the eyes like you see me do. Because these highlights are so strong, before I use the Gaussian blur, I'm going to use the blend tool to kind of blend out the very edges of the eyebrows, and then we'll go ahead and use Gaussian blur to soften up all of the edges. Since that looks pretty good, now we can just go back to the hat, the body, and the leg. So go ahead again and use the shading first, and just kind of follow along as I do in the video. Use the Gaussian blur to soften it up a bit, and just move on. Go from the leg and the foot, then to the body, and then to the hat. we're just going to repeat this same process for the rest of his body, using the color blend mode to add some shadowing and using the lighter blue to add some highlights. So go ahead and just follow along to finish up his body. Now that we've added all of his shadowing and highlights, the last thing we need to do is add some detail to his mustache and beard and his sideburns. So using the dry brush in Procreate, Go ahead and create a new layer above the beard and the mustache, and using a light gray, just add some detail for the hair. As I was finishing up the detail on the beard, I realized I forgot to give him some eyebrows. So let's go ahead and just do that really quickly. Using white, go ahead and draw in some eyebrows, and then you'll want to add a clipping mask on top of it and also add the gray hair detail using the dry brush. So the beard and the mustache, the edges are just too perfect. So now we just want to use the smudge tool, and using the dry brush, go ahead and smudge out the edges to make it a little bit more imperfect. And lastly, for the beard, we want to add some shadowing all around the edges. So create a new layer with a clipping mask, and using your soft brush and a light gray color, just go ahead and add a little bit of gray around the whole edge. At this point, all that's left to do is do the same thing for the mustache, give it the hair detail and smudge around the edges, and then add a little bit of hair detail to his sideburn, and you are done. You have your completed Papa Smurf. I hope you had a great time making your Papa Smurf, and thanks so much for watching.